but I had that talk had the title that Peter gave me, which was Money, Water, and Fish: Economics of Reconciliation. So I've kept that first part and just want to talk now about prospects for reconciliation, because I don't just want to talk about the economics of it. And so here's the sort of background to this. I've been lucky since late 2005 to work with a lot of the folks here, especially from the Watershed Sciences Center. You can see them up here and some of them in the room. Over time, we broadened and brought in folks from some other places besides Davis, including Brian Gray from Hastings, who I think was he here for one of the earlier talks, Buzz Thompson from Stanford, Ariel Dinar from UC Riverside. Some of these pieces have involved people from other far-flung places as well. And so what I'm giving you today is sort of reflections really that come from this body of work, some of which pretty much every other project focuses on the delta, and then we take a break because we can't take it anymore, and we need to think about things that seem easier, which has meant that we have not yet worked on the Salton Sea. That's so, but I'm showing here, a few of these are very large pieces, including our first two Delta books, and then we did Managing California's Water, which probably some of you have seen. The subtitle of that is From Conflict to Reconciliation. So we were thinking about reconciliation, and Peter in particular, and also our legal team did a lot of really good thinking about what that means in California aquatic context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And so then in a couple of the more recent pieces, well, so one of them, Water and the California Economy, I'm going to show you some data from them. That was a sort of big think panel piece to look at sort of what's the importance of water to the economy, and that allows you to also think about where ecosystems fit in. And I'm not showing you here because the cover is really ugly. We just came out with a new report that some folks from here, including Jay and Josue and Robin Sideth, have been involved in looking at how to pay for water, the water system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that as well in what I fling at you here. So outline for you. First going to be the good news part. That's the water and money part. That's where water and the economy. And then there's part two, which is water and fish. First part, that's some bad news. And that's drawing heavily on the work of Peter and his colleagues. And then part two on the water and fish is some hopeful directions. It's going to be really giving just a little quick thought about where ecosystem reconciliation fits in. And then where I really hope we're going to have the most time to spend is on this last part, which is money and fish, which is, I'm not completely pessimistic about it, but there's definitely tough work ahead. And I think, the prospects part, and whether you feel the prospects are good or bad, it really kind of relates to the things I'm going to talk about here. So, okay. What was the first one? It was money and water. Money and water, the good news is that California's economy is getting more and more resilient and robust to being able to live within its means in terms of water supply. And we're not perfect yet, but we're getting much better at it. And a lot of that has to do just with the luck of the way our economy is evolving, in that we don't depend on water as much as we used to as a major production input. Agriculture is now 1% to 2% of state GDP, depending on if you count all of the manufacturing of ag products as well as primary production. Ag still uses about 80%, 75, 80% of the human water use, with the urban areas using the other 20, 25%. If you look, this is sort of looking over time since 1960. These are just normal or normalized years. There's a lot of more variation in dry years and wet years. So this is kind of, as smooth as you can kind of get to take that out of the picture. And the total looks like it really hasn't increased on average since the early 80s. And part of that is increased flow requirements, in-stream flow requirements, and sort of requirements to not take water out of some systems. But fundamentally, we've been managing within that, and ag is actually often shrinking a little bit too. Urban, flat, even coming down a little bit despite population growth. So that's a good thing. And this shows you more in economic terms. So this is some ratios comparing, factoring in water, state GDP per capita, and how that looks in different ratios. So here is water use per capita, which is half as high, statewide human water use, half as high as it was in the late 60s. State GDP per capita, real GDP, is twice as high. You can see the effects of the recent recession. It kind of didn't grow there, but we're coming out of it now. And then the top one, that's the sort of the water story in economics terms is, to summarize very, very briefly, state GDP per unit of, real GDP per unit of water use 4 times as high as it was in 1967. And part of this is an ag story, that ag is becoming more productive, economically productive with every drop it's using. Shifting to higher value crops, higher yields, the whole, all of the things that, it's a very modern agribusiness sector that we've got in California, and they're always looking for possibilities for improving. But that's really not the main story. The main story is that ag is becoming a smaller share of the economy. And so what happens in ag is very important for ag and for some counties, some parts of the state, but it's not the main driver of the state's economy. And that's why this drought is, because the urbans have done a lot to be in better shape in terms of drought resilience, this drought is really about agriculture and the environment. It's not really about the economy of California in a writ large, or state macroeconomic effects. So these trends are likely to continue, and this was something from that Water and the Economy report from 2012 that this panel of 15 experts agreed on. Urban area, you expect continued efficiency gains and sort of managing with scarcity. Ag, probably continued reductions in land use, continued reductions in water use, and continued move to higher value crops, crops that are earning higher profits and generating more revenue per unit of water and land use. And this is a sort of, it's sometimes troubling to say that there's some okay news about climate change, but the modeling suggests, there are a lot of bad things about what's going to happen in terms of climate change, but from a water supply perspective, it looks like California will be able to handle that, and its economy will be okay with it. And that is based on work that Jay Lund and Richard Howitt and Josue Medellin Azuara have done, looking, really torturing the climate with models going all the way out to 2100 and big population increases, and it's still okay. And then even if you just look at ag, which is the most water-dependent sector, this shows you out to 2050 some modeling work that they did for the Energy Commission, which is published in the journal Climatic Change in a 2012 article. Historical climate is the yellow, and then the green is a warm, dry climate change, which is like, what is it, 2.5 Celsius increase, I think, something like that, by 2050, and dry. So farm water use would go down by nearly 30%, irrigated acreage by almost as much. Farm revenues in real terms would still be positive, not as positive as with historical climate, but still, way better if you're looking at these declines, and that's because of these productivity enhancements and basically switching to the continued switch to higher value crops. This presumes smart water management in the ag sector and the ability to transfer water when let it go to the higher value places. Okay, so now we're moving into the gloom and doom part, and probably, I don't know, I didn't get a chance to look at all of the earlier shows, whether you've seen this graph or not before. This is one that we drew from Peter and Jacob Katz and Rebecca Quinonez's work, doing a census of sort of what's been happening with fish populations. We use this in the Managing California's Water book as kind of one of the key problems that California faces in water management, because it tells a story, a sad story, really simply. So this is based on pulling together information from 3 different points in time where Peter And collaborators looked at the status of our native fish species, of which, I don't know, the numbers have increased a little over time as you found more species, I guess, right? But the basic story is not a good one. And to me, so you can see how they're categorized here. We've done one good thing, which is have no new extinctions since 1989. But that's a pretty low bar. We've increased the number of listings at the pace of about 1 a year, which to me is not necessarily bad news because there's it takes a while to list things, and probably a lot of those were not in great shape in '89 already, and it's a matter of getting them listed. So the really worrisome thing is this beige here, and that is combining some categories that collectively could be called fish of special concern, where the populations are not doing well. Either they should be listed already, and the resources mean that they haven't been able to be listed, or they're on their way to being qualifying for listing. And you can just see the trend there going up, so that by 2010, fewer than 20% of the species of the state's native fish species were not in some trouble and in a sort of reasonably secure state. And the really bad news about this is that this is at a period, during a period where we've had, the environmental laws came in the late 60s, early 70s. This is, decades hence. There's been a lot of effort and attention and really, money and water and various kinds of efforts thrown at trying to solve this problem, and we have not been cracking it. And this is leading to tremendous conflicts in terms of water management, because especially when anything is on the emergency list at being listed, that just makes any kind of water management, water investment very complicated and costly. So why did this happen? Just run through this really fast. The message, and this is really from Managing California's Water, Chapter 5, it happened for a lot of different reasons relating to the sort of need or the desire for humans to tame our system to make it more useful for us. So both, sort of dealing with the fact that we have a drought every summer and needing water for irrigation and urban uses, but also the fact that we have variability and we sometimes have floods and we sometimes have droughts, and we need to store water for that. This is a map that shows you what that has done to the main stem habitat for salmon and steelhead. Anything that's red there is no longer accessible. That's just one of the things that happened from sort of this remanagement of our natural systems. A lot of alteration of downstream habitat as well, disturbance of natural flow patterns, all of which is not great for critters that evolved in this kind of more variable environment. Land development has been a huge factor too. This just spotlights the Central Valley. Everything in yellow, orange, and red was wetlands in 1900. Now there is less than 5% of that left, just the red. There's been a little replacement up in the rice fields, starting around this area and on up. That's the gray. That's up until very recently been thought of mainly as useful for non-fish type critters like birds and garter snakes and things. With the work that's been done recently, it looks like maybe there's potential for that to be more useful also for fish, which is a really cool idea. And I think is probably one of the most hopeful things that I've seen coming out of this whole reconciliation idea. This has been, again, one of those things that's been, at least from a certain perspective, good for people. It makes the land farmable. It keeps, flood protection. There are other ways to do this that can also provide some of those benefits if you don't need to use all of that land. And so that's where the idea of kind of making more room for the river with flood management comes in. Water quality, still a huge concern. The second generation of the Clean Water Act has been focusing on runoff, sort of stormwater and other polluted runoff. But we're far from there yet in terms of managing it, and it's very expensive to do that. And a lot of the solutions really focus on protecting people by making sure that our drinking water is safe. Well, that works for us more or less. It doesn't work for the critters that are in these watersheds that are facing some of these problems. So, climate change is just going to make this worse. This is more cheery news from Peter. I don't know. You can just keep at it, Peter. But, so this is a study that they just published. This was also Energy Commission, or was this Fish and? Yeah. Okay. Looking at for the 121 fish that still are around, how are they going to do native fishes and then alien fishes? And you can see that this is climate change is going to make things tougher for them, both in terms of temperature changes, lower flow availability late in the summer, difficulty in managing cold pool and reservoirs, the works. Okay, so now the hopeful directions. And I was lucky enough to be here for the first talk of this series. So you got the man in person, Michael Rosenzweig. We really drew on his work and some of the body of work kind of around that idea in thinking for managing California's water and some more recent stuff that we've done on the Delta. The idea is, how do you make lemonade out of the lemons that you've got, really? And the notion that sort of the traditional strategy of just thinking in terms of reserves and restoration is not going to do it, because too much land and too much of the resource base is used by humans, and you've got to figure out ways to make that more compatible with what critters need. So, the term reconciliation ecology, this is how at least I interpret it. It acknowledges the extent of the human footprint. It makes this footprint more careful, and it looks like from the early notes from Michael's drafts, that was actually his draft title was, I think, The Careful Foot or something like that. And then the marketing people got a hold of him and called it WinWin Ecology. And then crucially, I want to stress this because I'm going to come to this in terms of where we need to be thinking, is that it's not just about, it's not restoration, it's about trying to recreate as much of the kind of habitat and signals that critters need so that they can survive. A lot of times that means using technology. And that is something that's scary for a lot of people, including a lot of scientists, as I'm going to show you in a bit. Now, this was sort of, Michael's book really doesn't talk a lot about aquatic ecosystems, so that's where Peter comes in. And Chapter 5 of Managing California's Water really is a little bit of a manifesto on that, sort of thinking statewide. And then a piece called Where the Wild Things Aren't that came out in 2012 looks specifically at the Delta and tries to think about reconciliation ecology in that context. But here's a kind of a list of the kinds of things you want to be thinking about in aquatic ecosystems. So the idea of more natural flow regimes, which is not the same thing as saying go back to unimpaired flows. It's thinking about what kinds of, do you need pulse flows? What are the patterns in that? So, arguably what they're going to be trying on the Colorado River Delta is sort of, in that spirit. Puda Creek is a good example of that, where it's something like 5% of the unimpaired flows are used to extremely good effect in terms of making it a much better place for the natives to hang out relative to invasives that often move in when we've managed these systems in artificial ways. Another thing, setting back and removing levees, making more room for the river so that you're getting the flood protection you want in ways that are good for the economy, as well as having better accommodating habitat for critters, reoperating, retiring dams, improving the way we manage hatcheries, reducing contaminants, limiting new invasives, often thinking about technology to do that. And this is a controversial one, although it's sort of just there, doesn't necessarily seem controversial, is specializing some streams, which is not something that current policy, environmental policy, really favors. So example, think on the Central Coast. You've got all those, I don't know if you remember my map with all the red lines where steelhead used to be able to go and can't anymore. Instead of trying to do that, get that happening everywhere, you figure out where to get the most bang for your buck on some of that, and then give up on some other places and try to focus your efforts well. So on the whole technology thing, this is some results from a survey that we did as part of the last project that we've done as a group on the Delta. The overall report is called Stress Relief, Prescriptions for a Healthier Delta Ecosystem. It came out about a year ago. And one of the things that we did was we surveyed scientists who've been working on the Delta ecosystem, and then also a lot of different stakeholder and policymaker folks to see what they thought about various things about the management of multiple stressors in the system. And this shows you in a compressed way, there were about 30 actions, and scientists were asked to pick their top 5 that they would do as a thinking about their interactions and as a menu, what they would do. And what this shows you, we group them into 9 categories. So just as an example, reduced discharges, you could do it through point source, non-point source, ag, urban. There were maybe 5 different ways to do that. Hatchery management, various different things. Diversion engineering includes peripheral tunnels, but it also includes things like fish screens, like gates, to operable gates in the Delta. Invasive control, a lot of different kinds of ways to try to jigger around with the system there to make that work. Harvest management, also some technology-related stuff as well as just policies. The scientists really loved the idea of improving habitat and flow. You can see that we did some cluster analysis, and almost everybody had at least a couple of actions in those areas. They were really lukewarm about all this other stuff, and including, just really low, and pretty much anything sort of technology-oriented, low. And in other questions, just asking them for each of these different techniques, how much did they like it or not? How promising did they think it was? The technology stuff was low, 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 low. And the sort of, the natural flow process, habitat idea, that resonated a lot, but often involving a lot of more water too. So not the 5% or 10% kind of thing. Okay, just as background, now we're going to get into the sort of meaty work ahead about money and fish, and thinking about how to make some of this stuff happen. So first, just as sort of context for that, healthy watersheds are a valuable economic asset to California, and in a few ways. There are some direct benefits in terms of tourism. Witness a few pictures here. There are also some spillover benefits. The economics literature looks at kind of what makes places attractive, what makes places attractive for highly productive workforces. Amenities are part of that. California has those. That's why people are willing to live here, even though it costs a lot in terms of housing costs are high compared to some other places because of various kinds of public amenities, including the nature that we've got, and the fact that you can just get out and hike pretty easily, get in your car and get to Yosemite. Usually most winters go skiing or snowboarding, all of that. So that's a sort of a benefit, an economic benefit that it takes some work to measure, but it can be measured. And then more fundamentally, Californians, we do a lot of public polling at my institute. They are environmentalists, and this really goes across party lines. It goes across age groups. There's a lot of support for things even that won't necessarily give folks direct benefits. Sort of, if you think about all the climate change stuff, that's long term, right? That's thinking about your grandchildren, future generations, and people are voting for that, and they are, they did not support, even during the height of the recession. There was a proposition that would have overturned AB 32. That went down with, pretty high no vote. So it just suggests that there's a basis for getting people to buy into the idea of improving the health of our watersheds. That said, it is definitely not a blank check, and so we have to think about it, judiciously in terms of what do we want to ask people to pay, and what do we want to ask them to give up, because although Michael Rosenzweig's book is titled WinWin Ecology, it doesn't mean that there are no trade-offs in thinking about this kind of stuff. it requires making choices. You know, reconciliation ecology strategy is exactly thinking about what, you know, sort of actively, what do we want the ecosystem to be like? And you're thinking about what's realistic from a natural, you know, life histories of species kind of perspective, and what your watersheds can support, but also in terms of what people are going to be willing to support, I think is important too. And it acknowledges that you're not going to be trying to save every species, I think. Or at least that some species may not make it. I guess that when I read Rosenzweig's book, you know, there's all of this analysis of the extinctions that have gone on before, and you know, it's really, in some ways, it's motivating why he's saying we have to make more room for species, because we've taken up too much of the resource base already, and in order to reduce that pressure, that's sort of the approach to it. So I just throw that out there, and we'll come back to it at the very end in terms of some thinking that I think, uncomfortable thinking that needs to be done. But this is just an idea of specialization. So this is from the Where the Wild Things Aren't paper, where we tried to look at this for the Delta and, you know, kind of think, all right, what's a realistic, you can't do everything everywhere in the Delta, just given what's happened to the physical landform, but also, you know, and the invasions of other species that have occurred and so on, but also thinking realistically about, you know, how much you're actually going to be able to devote in terms of resources to it. And so, you know, we came up with this scheme that looks a lot like Allison's historical Delta maps, actually, for those of you who have seen those. And I think we just saw that right at the very end. So, you know, it does show that there are ways in which you can try to sort of draw on what you know from past ecosystems and historical ecology to think about what's practical. But it's the idea, sort of a little bit the same idea as this stream specialization thing that I mentioned earlier in the Central Coast. So the other thing is that we have to think about where we're going to get the money for reconciliation, and it will cost money. It'll cost money for habitat. It'll cost money for infrastructure. It'll cost money for water sometimes if we need to increase flows. And it'll cost money for the science. And there are no good automatic ways to get that money right now. In general, I would say, in California, right now, the sort of modus operandi of the law is that if you're doing a new project, you've got to mitigate any forward-looking bad things that would happen with your investments, and not necessarily have to go back and fix stuff in the past. Sometimes people get forced through court orders to do some retroactive mitigation. But you know, there are a lot of things where there's low-hanging fruit out there that's just waiting for money to be applied to it. And here's a good example of that. This is the Matilha Dam on the Ventura River, which there's broad agreement in this watershed that this dam should come down. It provides no economic function anymore because it's completely silted up. It would provide steelhead habitat if it were removed. It would provide nice sand for the surfers down at the other end of the river. It would have to be done carefully to not cause flood control problems. So, you know, it's going to cost money to do it right, and they're basically just kind of waiting to figure out how they can fund it. That's an actual graffiti that was put on there, I don't know, a few years ago, and I don't know if it's still there. I remember at the time reading that the cops thought it was okay. They weren't going to prosecute. Right. So now, just back to this idea of scientists, because I think a lot of you are scientists, and sort of the technology side of reconciliation. So this is, again, from that survey that we did back in the summer of 2012. And here now I've broken out all of the different actions and ranked them by the share of scientists that picked it in their top 5 for things to do in the Delta. And then this is a log scale of our estimates of costs. This was work that was led by Josue Medina Suarez. So, you know, just to kind of give you a sense, there's some stuff that's way more expensive, right, because log scale. we did not ask scientists to worry about costs, so I want to excuse them right off. It's not like they were going out of their way to pick expensive stuff, but that's mostly what they picked, with the exception of the seasonal floodplains, which is, I think, thanks to the work that's been done here on the Yola bypass and maybe on the Cosumnes some. Most of the sort of technology stuff, with the exception of the tunnels, which admittedly is a big expensive thing, most of these are, most of the technology stuff is more in the lower area and way cheaper to do. We were amazed once we actually put numbers to that, how some of that stuff is probably, pretty darn cheap. And so it suggests that you'd want to be experimenting with some of these technological fixes. And that may not be anathema to everyone in this room, but I think there is a resistance to thinking about engineering in that way for the environment that we have to get past, especially if it's stuff that can be done experimentally and at relatively low cost. So just to finish on this, is little results from the survey for what other people thought about it. This is the correlation between other groups and the scientists on this, these priorities. Just look especially at the orange ones. The blue ones are just people also rank them, so you can see how they mesh with scientists on the ranking. So the folks that disagreed or that had very different views from scientists are, it's really not surprising, it's folks that are upstream. Scientists really like the idea of increasing upstream, reducing upstream diversions and increasing upstream flows into the delta. Exporter interest, they got hit on the exports and the upstream flows. Delta interests, a lot of habitat, even fishing and recreation. So the scientists agreed a lot more with the state and federal officials and with the environmental advocates than with the folks who would be directly probably footing the bill for some of this stuff in terms of, at least under the current regulatory expectation, that we're not using public funds to buy that water that would be put back into the system, that we're expecting water rights holders to just cut back on it. So just another point highlighting the importance of thinking about the costs, and that we're going to have to find compromises that can more or less work, and certainly be thinking about groups that are especially hit hard by some of these changes. Are there ways in which we need to use some public resources to help them out? So where can the money come from? A lot of talk in Sacramento these days about water bonds, and certainly this report that we just did, we found that the bonds from the 2000s, which were, as you can see, much more substantial than what we've had in earlier decades, still there's a lot of it's gone toward these ecosystem kinds of things, which is good. But now comes the question of what's going to be in the new bond? Will voters pass another bond? There was a bond on the ballot in 2010 that was moved to 2012 because of bad polling, moved from 2012 to November 2014 because of bad polling, and now I think there are 10, is that what we heard last week, 10 different bills in the legislature right now to try to, because the legislature doesn't think that the current bond that is slated for the ballot will pass, and so they're looking for some kind of package that they think has better passability and stuff in it that they would like. So, bonds are a possibility. We don't think that there's going to be enough in any bond to do it all. Bonds also do mean future taxes, so it's not like it's free money. New fees on water and land users are a possibility, contentious, but maybe necessary, and something where, to some extent, this can be happening at the local and regional level for sort of local watersheds, and we've seen examples of that. The Marin voters just approved a quarter-cent sales tax for open space and recreation and watershed health. In Santa Clara, voters have done that kind of thing as well. There are examples in different parts of the state where you see this, but it's small change compared to probably the price tag we're looking at for some big things like the Delta. So there probably would be a need for some state fees as well. And then there's the question of, can we use the dollars that we're spending better? And I think that this is really insufficiently explored terrain. What this shows you is overall water sector spending. It's about $30 billion a year, of which bonds contribute less than $1 billion. So, the bonds are important at the margin in some things, but they're not doing everything. And I've broken this down into capital and interest and operations, because where you especially see the ecosystem dollars are in the investments, in the capital spending, because that's where you've got to do the mitigation for new stuff. Some of it in the green areas too, because sometimes what counts as maintenance will come in there, and there has to be mitigation. So, probably, in this ecosystem spending here, about $700 million a year, that's really the fisheries agencies and some sort of very ecosystem-focused things, as opposed to all of the embedded mitigation that happens in the other areas. I estimate that just given the typical amount of mitigation that happens in investment projects, you're probably looking at about a doubling of this in terms of the total that's available. Maybe a little bit, $500 to $700, $800 million a year just through the investment process that goes into some kind of mitigation. And I will submit to you that that is often done in ways that are not getting the best bang for your buck. It's sort of going through the checklist that you get required to do at different points in your permitting process in order to get that to happen. So we need to use those dollars better is, I guess, my message here. I think that there's a lot of ripeness in the field for this. When we have workshops with policy folks and practitioners at all levels, we hear a lot about the need for making more sense of how the regulations work together in the context of permitting and licensing and so on. So this is just for the Delta, and this is just state and federal agencies. And I'm not sure if all the arrows actually really aligned in that way. But
it doesn't have all the arrows.
Yeah, it probably doesn't have all the arrows. And some of the arrows are broken, probably, when people are not talking to each other. But, sort of thinking about reconciliation at an institutional perspective, which is, kind of broader than the cash alone, is that you really have to think about this at a watershed scale. You can't think about it on a project-by-project basis. There's got to be a coordinated vision. I mean, that's the whole idea, I think, of ecosystem reconciliation, according to Michael Rosenzweig's vision, at least. You've got to have local engagement. He talked a lot about that. Partly because you want people to be stewards of their land resources, partly because you want them to be willing to pay and care about it. And you need more flexible oversight in order to be able to do this, because there are some things that you need to be able to try that are just, they're not part of the normal permitting rule book. And so we did a couple of case studies for this Delta Stressors project that we came out with last year. McCormick-Williamson Tract, an island in the Delta, in the North Delta, everybody agrees should become habitat. It's like local buy-in, it's already owned, it was bought by the state, it's owned by the Nature Conservancy, it's on the list of local projects that people won't object to. It's got all of the ingredients that most things in the Delta do not have, and yet, we had a hard time fitting on one page all of the hurdles that thing had to jump through in terms of permits, check-ins, sign-offs with different state, federal, and in some cases local agencies in order for that to go forward. And that's an easy one, right? Because that's one that people aren't going to be suing you about. So figuring out how to make that work, and I really do think there's a lot of appetite for it, but people just are not sure how to make that happen. There are some good examples actually in the context of renewables and renewable energy right now in the desert that we point out in that report that might be useful for thinking about our watersheds as well. And then big picture accountability, so that the folks that are signing off on permits are not going to just get, their main fear is not getting their agency sued. And if their agency is going to be sued because they have to check a box about sort of the way we've always done this, you can't blame them for standing in the way of all this grand big picture stuff. It's got to be something that's kind of agreed upon at the level of senior management and really in a coordinated way, and probably requiring both state and federal agencies to do this together as with top leaders involved. So it's not all bad, and this is just a list of a few things where people have been trying to move in the direction of more coordinated approaches to planning for improving ecosystem conditions. The HCP, Habitat Conservation Plans, and Natural Communities Conservation Plans, the state equivalent of that, are an example. And I think there's definitely some good things that have been happening on the ground. They initially have mostly been doing good stuff in terms of terrestrial ecosystems, not aquatic. Aquatic's harder, more moving parts, but it's a good idea. It's an ecosystem-based approach in principle. They're often too small still, and they often are limited to a few stressors. And I would say that's BDCP is really trying to get to be big on that, but even BDCP is not dealing with the upper watershed. Mitigation and conservation banks, I like these a lot because this is where you have private developers or also public agencies when they're doing projects. If you disturb land or habitat, you've got to make up for it. And there's usually some ratios of, depending on exactly what you've done, if it's temporary or permanent. But an acre of wetland that gets lost, you've got to replace a few acres. It used to be that you just sort of did your thing, and now there's been a real effort, and the feds have been very good at this actually, of trying to rationalize that by creating banks where you pay into it, and then somebody figures out where is a good place that you're really going to get some ecosystem value from it. We've collected some information on this. There's not much yet for aquatic ecosystems. Uptake has been slow in some contexts, but I think it offers a lot of potential. Regional water quality control plans. In the Managing California's Water book, this was something that we really got jazzed about. So at the end of the book, sort of we were like figuring out, okay, well, how do you try to encourage integration? And everybody been talking to us about all the permitting coordination challenges and everything, and integrated water management is important, but like how do you do it? And I think it was you, Jay. We were on this like phone call, with various of us on different phones, and the idea that we already are kind of organized by large watersheds for water quality in California. If you look at the map of, which actually I'll show you in a minute, but of the regional water quality control boards, those are based on watersheds. So, and they already do basin plans. Right now, they only focus on quality and flows, but you could think of that as the organizing principle and the focal point for other stuff. And a number of federal agencies that we've talked to, they recognize the problem. They would like to know how to do this and how to kind of plug in and be more rational about stuff. So offering them for California, telling them this is how we want you to do it would probably be welcome, at least for some of those agencies. Instead, what they're doing is each of them is making like their own regions to try to do this. So this really offers a lot of potential for kind of organizing local and state and federal. And then the Delta Plan just is an example of really trying to address multiple stressors in a very systematic way. But even for planning, for coordinating, even there, the law kind of makes upstream issues off limits, at least from a regulatory perspective, but we think that it has potential in a non-regulatory perspective. And so this is just a picture of our all-in approach that we were suggesting in the book. These are the regional water quality control board regions. Think about integrating across supply, quality, floods, habitat. Actually, we just learned transportation actually has to kind of be integrated into that too, if you're thinking about pollution control. And it sounds like maybe there's some interest on the part of some folks in Sacramento about this right now, so that's exciting. And then just I want to throw this out there without answering it. There's a lot that we can do for sure with our existing laws, and in Managing California's Water, we raised this question. We really, our legal team really pushed hard to sort of see, okay, how well can you make the existing laws work on this, and found that there's a lot you can do. But I think we're not alone in coming to the conclusion that there are some ways in which things are going to start to pinch and be an obstacle to the kind of forward-thinking reconciliation strategies that we're talking about here, both with respect to the Endangered Species Act and with respect to the Clean Water Act, which, in fairness to the drafters of that legislation, that was a long time ago. People were not thinking about climate change. And there was kind of a presumption that, a very optimistic presumption, I think, that bad stuff that's happened is our fault in a very direct local way. And arguably climate change, you can say, is bad stuff that's happening that's anthropogenically caused, but it's not something that you can address except through an adaptation perspective in terms of dealing with watershed health. These laws don't handle trade-offs very well. And just as an example, right now we're facing with the drought real trade-offs on, there's not a lot of surface water available, real trade-offs on balancing water between different listed species. And we don't have a good game plan for that, I think we're discovering. And there's probably ways in which science can help us anticipate and be better at that, but there's just not good ability for the ESA to provide guideposts on that, and also not good ability to be thinking about, you remember the graph I showed you of all the fish in the beige category that are in trouble but not quite listed yet, making decisions about, say there's a listed fish that's really on life support and may not make it, 30 years from now. It has a good probability of not being here, versus some fish that are not quite that bad yet, but that some efforts could really help to avoid getting to that point. You're not really able to do that now, or at least there are not good guideposts for that with the ESA. And the Clean Water Act has restrictions in it with respect to kind of anti-degradation that make it hard to relax standards for certain beneficial uses in the context of, say, like stream specialization that I gave as an example. So, and just as an example, and something I'd encourage you to take a look at on this, just with specifically, I think this is really Clean Water Act, probably, no, actually both, Clean Water Act, ESA, and then some other sort of California water law, a report that Jeff Mount, a panel that Jeff Mount led that involved also Bill, right? You were on it, and Brian Gray and Wim Kimmerer, reviewing the pre-public review draft of the BDCP with respect to a few questions in terms of how it would do for the environment. Our team has been talking about the BDCP or about the idea of peripheral tunnels, canals as something that could really be beneficial for the ecosystem because it gives you the potential for a lot more flexibility to manage the system in these kind of reconciliation type ways. What they found was that there's not a whole lot of flexibility in this project right now, because even though you would have the infrastructure that would allow you to do that, just the whole host of regulatory constraints that you have significantly reduces the operational flexibility. So now you could imagine, all right, maybe down the road, society will be ready to reduce some of that, or to increase the operational flexibility, and some of that can happen with money, to the extent that it's water rights that you can buy, compensate people for allowing more water to be in the system, for example. But some of them are, and maybe buying out some farmers who would be getting salty water, and they would be not complaining if you did that. But there are probably ways in which, over the longer term, we're going to have to be thinking about adapting these laws to the 21st century. And final thoughts to close is that this is going to be exciting, I think, and challenging, and we need strong leadership to implement ecosystem reconciliation. We need an engaging vision. And those of you who saw this talk before, I apologize, but here's my little goldfish. Willingness to take risks. And that includes by the science community, as well as by all of the practitioners and policymakers. Thank you.
Questions? you brought up as an incentive or an idea is to buy out farmers, so you could use their land for whatever it is. What about, you can pay them for the fair value of the land, but what about continued income, how they planned on passing the productivity of that land to their families for future generations? How do you quantify that, and then how can the state pay for that?
So I would say, first of all, it doesn't always have to be the state who pays, and there are examples of other local agencies actually compensating people for not doing certain things on their land that are beneficial. The market value of the land, there is a sort of a market, but then there's always a certain room for negotiation, and the purchase of the land can really cover the farmer's interests, including longer-term interests, if he or she is willing to do it at all, right? And some people will just not want to at all, but often money gives a lot of flexibility because it gives people the opportunity to do things elsewhere. And farmers don't always stay on the same land. You talk to farmers in the San Joaquin Valley; they got stuff all over the place. So I'm just to say it's not a solution for everybody, but money is the way to give people a lot of flexibility in terms of the farmer and his or her descendants. The other big important thing to think about that people often forget is that you want to think about the local economy, and especially the county government or the city government, who's not going to be getting the same tax revenues, or who right now often they think of the option value of wanting development and getting more tax revenues. So there are ways that you have to think about how to make them whole for that change in policy. And really, conservation easements are already kind of an example of this thing. Yolo County has some areas that are, I guess it's conservation easements that are being paid for by the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, basically paying them to, covering their flood insurance, I think paying the county something for, something in lieu of some in lieu taxes, and asking them not to raise their levies, because that is really important for protecting the much higher economically valued assets on the other side. So, it's a good example, I think.
A lot of us are working on a paper on reconciliation and dealing with how different disciplines approach reconciliation ecology. I was wondering, and one of the big challenges we've seen is within the law, the ESA can present some challenges in this reconciliation approach. Besides the law, where else would you find challenges in reconciliation ecology, and do you believe that all disciplines have the same perception and same objectives when they talk about reconciling economic growth and development in ecology?
So I'm not sure how widespread, we use these terms all the time, and you've been in a whole quarter-long course where people have been talking about it. I'm not sure the term is really, I think it's pretty rare concept. I think people more generally, just the idea of balancing economic and environmental values, or I would even broaden it to balancing economic, social, and environmental values, because sometimes there are social values that are not, that can't be translated into dollars, right? That's something that a lot of folks think about, and I think that cuts across people that really think about environmental management in some way. The specific constraints that you're going to find are going to vary, and they won't just be legal. They can just be habit too, and way of doing things, and that can include for science as well. For researchers, where especially if we're stuck in very disciplinary ways of doing, you have to advance science by doing disciplinary work. But then at some point you've got to make sure that somebody outside of your discipline can use it, or it might not get used.
I'm not sure about the extent to which this has already been done, but given the possibly inevitable loss of some species, do you foresee the need to rank the environmental or economic value of some species relative to others to inform their management and preservation? Or should it just be, at this stage, are we just looking to conserve everything?
So personally, I get anxious about the idea of putting dollar value on species. That there are economic techniques for doing that. It's sort of this whole area of non-market valuation. I mean, okay, some critters have like a commercial and recreational use too, but I'm thinking more about the existence value of species. There are techniques for trying to survey people to get a sense of how they value it. It makes me nervous. I prefer thinking about things in terms of what can you achieve at what cost. So kind of think about cost effectiveness in terms of how do you use your dollars best. And I do think that there's a need to think realistically about what the possibilities are. I don't think we should do that in a small ball kind of way. I think we need to, be thinking about, be optimistic about what can be done, but also be somewhat realistic in thinking about how to manage trade-offs, and that's probably something that should involve scientists and policymakers and members of the public. Because you do need it, you need people to be behind this.
Peter's going to be able to come up with this kind of ranking very easily.
Yeah.
Brad, you had a question?
Oh, yeah. When you're talking about navigating the permitting, regulatory quagmires and whatnot, you made a brief comparison to, I think, maybe solar energy, renewable energy in the desert. I was just kind of curious what those possible...
So, the idea there was, and we talk about this a little bit, there's a report, if you go to the stress relief report page, there's some more detailed reports, and it's one that Brian Gray is the lead author of, institutional and regulatory options for stressor management, something like that. And I think there's even a box on this. But we were trying to look for examples of, where people have tried to make it work in terms of streamlining. People get nervous about the word streamlining because they think it means, steamrolling. There you go. Right. So these are efforts just to try to bring the various agencies together that need to all sign off on stuff and have some high-level decision-making ability and monitoring to make sure that the stuff is on a track where it's not just sitting on people's desks. And so I feel like there are a couple examples from the energy sector. One of them is the renewables. And Rick, do you know about these at all? The federal legislation? Yeah, so it's but it involves at least one of them involves state agencies as well, and it involves the energy agencies. It involves the environmental agencies. There's air, there's critters, and as of, I have not checked this in a little while, but as of when we last checked, it was not without its challenges, including lawsuits, but it seemed like a good model. And we kind of drew on that model for the recommendation that we made for the Delta, which was to have, what do we call it, a DERC, Delta Ecosystem Regulatory Coordinator. And the idea would not be to have a unified permit or unified permitting authority, so the folks still have their responsibilities, but you'd have some focal point. It'd probably be like in the governor's office or at some place where people had to actually show up to meetings and, kind of resolve things. Because the bosses can sit together and resolve them. Middle managers cannot, because their job is to not get sued,
Katrina?
You talked a little bit about stream specialization, and you kind of made a reference to something that I would be curious if you could expound on more in terms of like prioritizing or restoration activities to places where they make the most bang for your buck. Like I find that sometimes, in some cases in California, we have environmental groups that end up setting those priorities for us through lawsuits, and sometimes they end up suing on things that are perhaps the least economically or environmentally preferable location to restore. And like maybe a good example would be the Salton Sea. It was man-made, it's a giant salt sink. Why are we even considering trying to restore it? And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we might be able to develop like some sort of California habitat plan or something to help us make those restoration decisions.
So I'm going to defer to Peter on this. I don't know if you want to talk about this at all now, but I think in the book what we said was there were like 140 different ecosystems. Go ahead, roll with it.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because there are so many different systems around the state, and you know, I got into this when I was part of the Sierra Nevada Ecosystem Project. I ranked all the ecosystems, the watersheds in the Sierra Nevada, according to their value for natural systems. And I really got raked over the coals for including some, like the South Fork Yuba River came up very low on my priority list. But it's also happens to be the home of a lot of very prominent environmentalists and poets like Gary Snyder and so forth. So obviously the human values have to come into this issue. I don't think I've answered the question, but it just shows that if you're going to, whatever we do to prioritize rivers, and watersheds or whatever, human values are going to come into it. But I think there are places where you can make trade-offs. You can say this stream is already got a big dam on it. It's never going to do much for fish or anything else. Let's not try to not spend millions of dollars building a ladder over the dam or whatnot. Instead, let's put that money into a neighboring watershed where you'll see more bang for your buck. But nobody likes to make those choices because everybody has their own favorite watershed. Every watershed has somebody who lives there who cares about it.
Right. But I think, even with that, you can have, there are certain kinds of amenities for people and recreational benefits, views and everything that don't necessarily involve some of the heavy lifting regarding recovery of native species, right? So it's not, the important message is that it's not abandoning these watersheds altogether, right? It's more sort of where do you focus your efforts for some of the more difficult.
For public funds.
Yeah.
So where do you focus your efforts?
Right. And I just want to say on the Salton Sea that I was just down in SoCal recently talking to researchers in some universities down there, and we've said it ourselves in we have a box on it, I think, in Managing California's Water, that folks look at it from the bird perspective. You could get a lot more bang for your acre foot in the Colorado River Delta probably than in trying to fix the Salton Sea. But it's not going to just go away as an environmental problem. It's going to be a huge air quality issue. So people down there are going to have to figure out some way to at least address that.
I wanted to draw an analogy to the flood control system that we initially had. First, it was decentralized. You had local landlords making their own levies, and then that didn't work well. So then you needed a more centralized flood control plan because each landlord wants to protect his own place, so they built bigger levies, and then there was just social injustice. And right now, at the stage that reconciliation ecology is, we've seen examples that are very decentralized. We've seen small successes. And the challenge and the problem I can sometimes see is that it could result in valuing ecosystems that may not necessarily be high on the priority list. So from a big picture approach and a systems-wide approach, you may find that, well, ecosystem A and ecosystem B are the most beneficial, they provide the most services. but right now we're looking at a very decentralized way. So turns out ecosystem C and D are being protected, and because of that, A and B that are actually more valuable ecologically are not given as much weight and priority. So my question is, when you're looking at reconciliation ecology, how can you have a systems-wide approach but still give the locals enough ownership that it can be successful?
Well, I think that ties kind of into the last discussion too. Partly, so in this water finance study that we just released, what we're suggesting is that we have to have a conversation in California about public benefits that is clearer about what the scale of those public benefits are, because it's been sort of what we've been discussing it in terms of, if it's a public benefit, then state bonds should go into paying for it, right? And there are really public benefits that are very local, and then there are some that are regional, and then there are some that are state or even, nationwide, and you don't necessarily want to stop people from doing things that are locally or regionally valuable to them, but it's more thinking about in terms of some of these big priorities for where ecologically very important, sort of that scientists can agree on and so on as key for preventing extinctions and whatever else. That may be where you want to make some hard decisions about where state bond funding goes, for example.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen.
Thank you.